Inflation is currently one of the major concerns. Do bonds outpace inflation, and how would an investor use bonds to hedge against unexpected changes in inflation?
Bonds can also play a fantastic role for folks who are concerned about inflation, because there are different categories of bonds. And one of the, within the government bonds, there's a category that is called Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, or TIPS. And what's fascinating about this is that it probably provides one of the best hedges against inflation. And why is that? Because in the contract, when you lend your money to the government using these tips, what the contract spells out is that if inflation goes up, the value of your bonds goes up to match the increase in inflation. So as inflation goes up, so does the value of your bonds. It moves in lockstep. So that's a great hedge for an investor who is concerned about inflation. You don't need to go to fancy stuff and all that. Tips can provide, for some people who are concerned about hedging inflation, a really fantastic way to hedge inflation. Now, for investors who are not necessarily concerned about everyday hedging, but they say, no, I do have some goals down the road, and I want to make sure that I'm protected, that if inflation takes keeps going up, whatever the case might be, I do want to make sure that I'm protected. It is important to know at that point, what are the different investments, what are different asset classes, as we know, that might be able to actually outpace inflation over the long run. So not necessarily hedge it every day, but how do we stay ahead of it? Because, let's say, Greg, you are roughly you might be a little younger than I am, but, we have goals that are maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So I'm more interested, like 10, 15, 20 years, what would outpace inflation, even if we have higher inflation years? So what we did is we looked at all the inflation years in the US, starting with the lowest, which happens to be, Greg, 1932. It was a 10% negative inflation, which is called deflation, in 32, to the highest, 1946, at about 18%. And we ranked all these years from the highest to the lowest. Then we cut it in half. We discarded the lower half, and we only looked at the above median inflation years. And we wanted to know, after inflation, how do different investments perform? And this is what we found, which is quite interesting. These very, very short-term government bonds that a second ago, they look fantastic because they don't really give you negative returns. When you account for inflation, let's say in T-bills, they don't keep up. After inflation, you are below by about 0.6%. So they're not doing a great job keeping up with inflation. However, the longer term bonds, they give you inflation back plus 0.4 above it. So here you recover inflation and you get a little bit more in these bonds. And then if you want to look at the corporate bonds, you can see that you get a little bit above inflation. You get inflation plus 0.9. And once again, the good news being that there are asset classes, there are investments that over the long run would outpace inflation. In these, again, we're looking at above median inflation years. Now, when you look at the stock market, did a really good job. The stock market did a fantastic job in a way, because on average in these above median inflation years, not only that you got inflation back, but on top of inflation, as an investor, on average, you would have gotten 4.9%. And within the stock market, you have like these companies that are large, mature, well-established, typically associated with large growth. And those also stayed ahead of inflation, not as much, but still ahead of inflation by 4.1. And for investors who want to diversify, and instead of large, they hold small. And instead of growth, they hold value. Small value was also an asset class that seems to, once again, significantly outpace inflation over the long run. So the ultimate story, packaging it all together, is that if you are concerned about hedging inflation, there are some tips, and there are funds that have these type of securities. If you're concerned about keeping and staying ahead of inflation. The good news is that there's good evidence to suggest that a diversified, balanced allocation, a portfolio, would give you a really good chance to actually outpace inflation over the long run, and stay ahead to make sure that you have your purchasing power when you're ready to achieve your financial goals.
Well, listen, thanks for being with us today. And Apollo, thank you for your time. Always great to see you. I really appreciate it. Until next time.
Thanks for having me.
Feel free to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we are on Instagram, and we are on LinkedIn. And as always, you can come to our website at pradocapital.com.